My name is Kenneth Horn-Wellington. I am the Research Director at the MHS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second session of the Conrad E. Wright Research Conference. And this one is on marriage and the amendments. Our first presenter is Dr. Carol Faulkner. She is a professor of history and associate dean for academic affairs at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. She's the author of Unfaithful Love, Adultery, and Marriage Reform in 19th Century America, Lucretia Mott's Heresy, Abolition and Women's Rights in 19th Century America, and Women's Radical Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Aid Bureau. She is also the co-editor of Interconnections, Gender and Race in American History, and Lucretia Mott Speaks, The Essential Speeches and Sermons. Professor Carol Faulkner.
It's really nice to be here. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to come. My computer's sort of freaking out here, so pardon me. So I was inspired to write this paper after reading about an exchange between Tennessee Republican Herschel Candler, a state senator, and Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, in Elaine Weiss's excellent The Woman's Hour. In August 1920, on the eve of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Candler, in a
Sorry, Carol, were you going to share your screen?
I will share my screen. I'm going to intermittently share my screen.
All right.
Yeah. So I just want, just for some change.
Sorry, it's not.
No, looking at me, looking at the screen. Yes, no, I will share my screen for sure. So Candler was attempting to defeat the vote in the Tennessee state legislature, and he accused Catt of advocating interracial marriage, or rejoicing at a day when, quote, Negro men could marry white women and it would be none of society's concern. This prompted a strong denial by Catt, who called Candler's statement an absolute fabrication. In case we think politicians are different today, Candler later admitted that he exaggerated from a speech by Catt. My recent book, Unfaithful, Love, Adultery, and Marriage Reform in 19th Century America, examines how a variety of activists helped redefine marriage as a voluntary relationship in which love alone determined fidelity. It also shows how the problems of marriage and adultery cut across and connected different reform movements, especially women's rights, abolition, spiritualism, free love, and utopianism. Though many reformers viewed marriage as a key issue for their cause, marriage reform itself was a scandalous fringe subject in the 19th century. And at a time when many Black Americans were fighting for their right to marry, criticism of marriage was also a matter of white privilege. In this book, I found only one Black marriage reformer, Paschal Beverly Randolph, a mixed-race spiritualist, freedmen's teacher, and Republican, who I talk a little bit about in this paper as well, and who himself had an interesting marital history. After the Civil War, he was open about his romantic interest in white women and other women, and his third and final marriage was to a white clairvoyant in Ohio at a time when interracial marriage in that state was illegal. On the right is Paschal Beverly Randolph, and he viewed race as just one ingredient in the magnetic sexual connection between men and women. And despite the heightened cries of miscegenation or interracial sex during this period, I was interested that Randolph did not appear to face any particular backlash or criticism for his choice of spouse. So my book, along with the exchange between Candler and Catt, prompted this exploration of the connection between political rights and marriage rights from the 15th to the 19th Amendment. In researching the ways the debates over the 15th and 19th Amendment invoked the specter of interracial marriage, I found three things. First, the 15th Amendment, even more so than the 14th or 19th Amendment, was labeled the Miscegenation Amendment. And the outcry focused not only on the potential of marriage between Black men and white women, but on the rights of Black and white women, including suffragists. Second, despite the exchange between Herschel Candler and Carrie Chapman Catt, the threat of interracial marriage was not wielded against the 19th Amendment as it had been against the 15th Amendment. Even so, as with the 15th Amendment, white Southern politicians focused on Black women's voting rights as a particular danger. And then third, among some activists, abolitionists, feminists, and civil rights activists, support for interracial marriage was consistent throughout this period and helps explain Catt's strong reaction to Candler's statement. As suffragists were in the final decade of their fight for the 19th Amendment, the NAACP was challenging new state laws banning interracial marriage. I begin my paper in the 1830s with the movement to overturn the ban on interracial marriage in Massachusetts. But beyond this successful movement, Black and white abolitionists challenged racial separation in a variety of ways. For example, in 1838, interracial meetings at the newly opened Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia inspired citywide rumors of a marriage between a white woman and a Black man, likely prompted by the wedding of Angelina Grimke and Theodore Dwight Wells, which included Black and white guests. As a mob gathered outside the so-called Temple of Amalgamation, oops, see if I can move slides. There we go. The Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women did not back down and resolved to socialize with African Americans as they did with their fellow white citizens. When the women left the building, of course, the mob destroyed it. During and after the Civil War, the charges of amalgamation increased. And perhaps most famously in 1863, seeking to undermine Lincoln's re-election, Democratic newspaper editors published this pamphlet, Miscegenation, the Theory of the Blending of the Races, applied to the American white man and the Negro, thereby coining a new term for interracial sex and marriage. This pamphlet charged that Republicans supported the mingling of the races, particularly the marriage of Black men to white women. This pamphlet influenced the way Americans debated racial equality for decades, including in the debates over the 14th and 15th Amendments. In my research, I was surprised to find that even though the 14th Amendment had much more potential to affect state laws banning interracial marriage, the 15th Amendment became known as the Miscegenation Amendment. I give a number of examples in the paper itself, and I'll offer a few here. A newspaper in my hometown of Syracuse, New York, asserted that the 15th Amendment would be, quote, the beginning of Negro agitations, office seeking and holding, social claims to equality, and aspiration for miscegenation, end quote. In response to the 15th Amendment, a Democratic congressman from Missouri proposed a constitutional amendment prohibiting miscegenation. It did not move forward, but it would not be the last time that such a constitutional amendment was proposed. I was also interested in the fact that the concerns did not solely focus on marriage between Black men and white women. Black women came to personify the 15th Amendment, as in Phelps, New York, when a train arrived with, quote, a huge copy of the 15th Amendment, feminine gender, who was looking for her husband, a respectable young white man named Phillips, who she had married in Virginia during the war. A local newspaper opined, quote, behold the legitimate fruit of the Republican principles you profess. Newspapers also illustrated the story of a Dr. Schroeder in Bloomington, Illinois, who fulfilled his promise that, quote, whenever Negroes were granted the right to vote, he would promenade the streets of Bloomington with a Negro woman and a band of music to show that there should be no distinction on account of color. The, quote, daughter of Ham had to be convinced to join Schroeder, but she took his arm during the procession, her, quote, color entitling her to, quote, all the benefits arising out of the 15th Amendment, despite the fact, of course, that the 15th Amendment did not enfranchise women. Suffragists also received the radical label of miscegenation. When Susan B. Anthony made a speech denouncing racial prejudice in Chicago, the article earned the title Miscegenation. This newspaper, published near her home in Rochester, implied that Anthony herself engaged in a form of interracial romance. Quote, Susan herself is so free from this pettiness that she will take none other than black snuff, has adopted molasses-colored spectacles, and rounds her periods with the flourish of a yellow handkerchief. In 1884, the second marriage of Frederick Douglass to Helen Pitts, a white woman who worked as his clerk in the Recorder of Deeds office in Washington, D.C., tested these suffragist commitments. The Douglass marriage itself, of course, made a clear statement in favor of interracialism. But both blacks and whites objected. One white newspaper noted that, quote, Fred Douglass fell in love with miscegenation. A black newspaper described the marriage as a national calamity. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton proposed writing a public letter of support and congratulations to Douglass, Susan B. Anthony offered a strenuous objection. As she wrote Stanton, she viewed Douglass's marriage as a dangerous distraction, a setback to the, quote, growing feeling of friendliness toward our cause, women's suffrage. If Douglass and his new wife appeared at their next convention, which they subsequently did, she feared that the, quote, question of amalgamation would overwhelm the grand principle of equality of rights and chances for women. Anthony also expressed dismay at the very fact of his remarriage to a black or white woman and viewed it as distasteful and stereotypical to marry a younger employee. Helen Pitts, who is seated on the right in the image, was 20 years younger than Frederick Douglass. She also viewed Helen as Douglass's inferior in intellect, position, and wealth. The Douglasses were able to marry in Washington, D.C. because there was no law to prevent it, making the nation's capital a distinct outlier in that region. Though Congress considered passing such a law on numerous occasions, these attempts failed into the 20th century. The neighboring states of Maryland and Virginia retained their pre-Civil War bans on interracial marriage, only adjusting them to reflect the end of slavery. Tennessee, where Herschel Candler charged Carrie Chapman Catt with advocating interracial marriage, had outlawed the practice since 1822. After the Civil War, as Peggy Pascoe has shown, more and more states began to add so-called miscegenation laws, barring the marriage of whites to blacks, Native American Indians, people of Asian descent, and other racial groups. In 1883, just a year before Douglass's marriage, the Supreme Court had ruled in Pace versus Alabama that such laws did not violate African American civil rights. By 1913, 29 states had outlawed interracial marriage. These state laws, as well as attempts to challenge them, provided one context for the debate over the 19th Amendment. As I argue in the paper, Catt's reaction shows that Candler hit his target. As Catt recognized, Southerners feared the enfranchisement of black women with the 19th Amendment. She later recalled, quote, as late as 1920, the average Southern Democrat was filled with explosive rage at any mention of women's suffrage. His response to all appeals was a scornful, sputtering ejaculation, Negro women, end quote. In response, she pointed out that sheer numbers meant that women's suffrage would guarantee white supremacy in the South. Despite Catt's assurances, she knew that many of her allies continued to support legalizing interracial marriage. And in the paper, I offer the examples of Mary White Ovington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Addie Hunton, all members of the NAACP. And I'll just focus on Mary White Ovington for the purposes of this short presentation. Some of the earliest and most successful efforts of the NAACP focused on fighting new miscegenation laws, especially after the 1912 marriage of boxer Jack Johnson to a white woman, his second such marriage, which prompted many states to consider laws against interracial marriage, even if, like New York State, they had never had them before, and New York never did have one, but they considered it. Unsurprisingly, Ovington, a white woman, found her motivations for working with African Americans called into question. Prior to the founding of the NAACP, Ovington was a member of the Interracial Cosmopolitan Club, which organized a 1908 dinner in New York City that came to be known as the Miscegenation Dinner. The gathering, she wrote, became a meeting of voluptuous white women and smirking Negro men. A Savannah newspaper described Ovington as the, quote, high priestess who affiliates 5 days a week with Negro men and dines with them in her home in Brooklyn on Sunday. Though the dinner received the label of miscegenation, Ovington noted that only white newspaper editor Hamilton Holt had mentioned the topic as one of, quote, 4 possible solutions to the race problem. And I talk a little bit about this in the paper. I'm not going to talk about it here, about how activists viewed the slow blending of the races as one possible resolution to the race inequality. So like Susan B. Anthony and other interracialists, Ovington argued that equality would lead to less sexual immorality. And she was especially concerned about stopping the abuse of Black women. Her focus on Black women's rights put her in conflict with Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, and others who wanted to placate Southerners' concerns about Black female voters, and aligned her with African Americans in the NAACP. The NAACP had to exercise care when campaigning against miscegenation laws, and they redirected the national conversation away from white women and towards the impact on Black women. Jack Johnson had been threatened with prosecution under the Mann Act, but Ovington was far more concerned with, quote, the proportionately larger Black slave than white slave traffic. The NAACP also addressed this same concern in its campaign against a miscegenation law in Michigan. Quote, whenever colored people oppose anti-intermarriage laws, the claim is they want social equality, whatever that is. But the truth is colored men want to see their women protected. So to conclude, during the debates over the 15th Amendment, opponents of political equality had argued that voting rights led directly to marital rights. While such arguments often focused on the possibility of marriage between Black men and white women, they also offered a much broader depiction of social equality, an entire undoing of racial and sexual relations, in which white women might choose Black men and Black women might demand legal recognition of their relationships and children with white men. During the fight for the 19th Amendment, with the widespread adoption of anti-miscegenation laws across most of the United States, the leading white suffrage organizations largely succeeded in distancing themselves from the controversial issue of interracial marriage. Interracialists found an alternate home in the NAACP. These activists recognized that sexual relations across the color line had always occurred, and laws banning marriage only increased inequality. For interracialists, the issue of intermarriage had a direct impact on the status of Black women, a population that had long worried Southern anti-suffragists. For different reasons than their opponents, these activists realized that the issue of marital rights and political rights could not be so easily separated. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Carol. All right, our next presenter is Jessica Derleth. Jessica is an oral history researcher with The History Makers, a nonprofit organization that records, preserves, and disseminates oral histories of both well-known and unsung African Americans. She earned her PhD in U.S. history from Binghamton University. Her dissertation is titled Silence Forever the Slander, Gender as Political Strategy in the American Women's Suffrage Movement. And she is the author of Kneading Politics, that's K-N-E-A-D-I-N-G, Kneading Politics, Cookery, and the American Women's Suffrage Movement, published in the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And she is currently working as an on-set historical consultant with HBO's new series, The Gilded Age. Jessica, welcome to the MHS.
Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you as well to the conference organizers for adapting so well in these unique times and getting us moved over to a digital format. I'm going to get my PowerPoint going. Okay, so again, thank you for being here. Today I'm talking about a portion of my research that focuses on how and why suffragists manipulated gender and marriage norms in their rhetoric and in their printed material and public spectacles. I want to start today by sort of giving you a sense of what brought me into this research by sharing some sort of samples in a way of what intrigued me and brought me into this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a series of quotes sorry, my computer's having a hard time. I'm going to show you a series of quotes and ask you to take a moment as I read them to decide whether you think this quote was written by a suffragist or an anti-suffragist. So really try to anticipate where you think each person stood on votes for women. The first quote, "Women must realize that the home is the real thing in this world, and women must rule over it like a queen, for its duties are endless." Anti-suffragist. "The duties of motherhood and the making of a home are the most sacred work of women and the dearest of them to every class." Suffragist. "Do not mistake me. No woman should spend all her time at home. Public needs and social duties must be attended to." Anti-suffragist. "It is certainly good scripture that woman was created to be a helpmate for man." Suffragist. And last but not least, "No good suffragist should permit the cause to interfere with her home duties, and Miss Rupp should have prepared her husband's supper before going out to speak." From a suffragist. So once we see all of these words together, at least for myself, I find them remarkably similar. And for me, when I first started reading primary sources on the suffrage movement many, many years ago, this felt very jarring. You know, I was seeing people who are on complete and opposite sides when it came to the question of women's voting rights, yet they were using very similar gendered rhetoric to talk about the roles and duties of women. And so it was really my confusion and my curiosity in seeing this surprising overlap that led to my research and my research on gendered rhetoric within the women's suffrage movement. This paper for today, for this conference, looks specifically at how anti-suffragists and suffragists use gendered rhetoric related to marriage. I primarily focus on how the National American Women's Suffrage Association and its affiliated organizations at state and local levels used print culture and public spectacle that was meant to sway the public. So this is their effort to speak to the public and to counteract anti-suffrage claims. So anti-suffragists, when talking about marriage, often argued that the suffrage movement wanted to destroy the family as the core unit of government. They claimed that they wanted to stop men as husbands and as fathers from politically representing their families and voting on behalf of their wives and children. Anti-suffragists pointed directly to suffragists as individuals to use them as evidence, describing them as unwomanly, unsexed, promiscuous, free lovers, spinsters, and non-mothers. Worse yet, they warned that these abnormal women and the, quote, effeminate men who supported them would spread their sexual radicalism and their rejection of marriage around the entire nation through the vehicle of forcing the ballot upon innocent, unsuspecting American women. They predicted that if women got the vote, there would be a decrease in marriage, there would be fights between husbands and wives, there would be an increase in divorce, and that communities would fracture. Now, I argue that suffragists responded to these anti-suffrage claims by using print media and public spectacle to associate their movement with normative understandings of gender, sexuality, and marriage. They upheld men and women as distinct sexes with natural and differing skills. They argued that women's enfranchisement actually improved marital harmony, and they displayed their children and their babies as proof that they embraced monogamous reproductive marriage. Now, this certainly was not what all suffragists believed or said, and were often inconsistent and said things in one setting but not another. However, this line of argumentation was significant, and it had a very large role in the printed literature and the public events hosted by NASA and similar organizations. And I argue that it was an intentional political tactic where suffragists co-opted and manipulated anti-suffrage arguments to justify the expansion of the franchise with normative understandings of gender, sexuality, and marriage. The organized and institutionalized anti-suffrage movement that emerged at the turn of the 20th century frequently portrayed marriage as a unit of government, one where men represented their dependents, mothers, wives, daughters, and young sons, and they warned that anyone who wished to change this arrangement also wished to change marriage and the family. For example, one 1913 anti-suffrage pamphlet explained that society simply could not sustain women's suffrage and healthy marriages. It said, "Monogamous marriage teaches that man and wife are one, that the husband, wife, and children compose a family unit, that the father is responsible for the protection and support of the family, while the woman's suffrage doctrine teaches there is no family unit, that the husband and the wife are independent of each other." To prove that suffrage and marriage could not coexist, anti-suffragists portrayed suffragists as sex radicals and spinsters who waged war on marriage. They made these arguments in many ways. For example, they often criticized the personal lives of women like Susan B. Anthony, who never married. But for right now, for this presentation, I'd like to focus on a few visual examples that help really illustrate these stereotypes. Postcards like this one seen here caricatured female suffragists as shrill, undesirable, and unmarriageable. Here we see Miss Lemon walking down the street, holding a speech on women's rights, and the caption says, "She would do as she pleased, that no man should rule her, bamboozle, or fool her, so this lemon never was squeezed." This very much reflected larger arguments that no man would marry a woman who demanded women's rights. And in this case, her determination to not be fooled or bamboozled rendered her unattractive and unworthy of male affection. And we saw this as well in the last two slides with those other images of suffragists. Another set of visuals focused on men who found themselves married to suffragists. Anti-suffragists generally portrayed these suffrage husbands in two ways. One is that they were unmanly male suffragists who voluntarily forfeited their manhood and their masculinity by joining their wife in the suffrage movement. Anti-suffragists described these suffrage couples as sex radicals who practiced and advocated for birth control, free love, and trial marriages. Together, they undermined marriage by advocating for these policies and for their spread through women's enfranchisement. The second image of the suffrage husband, which is also the more common and widespread image, is that of a suffering husband, a man who is abused, neglected, and abandoned by his suffrage wife. These men are sympathetic figures who fall victim to their wife's activism. And in these narratives, female suffragists possess so little regard for marriage and family that they abandon their spouses and their children for more exciting public life. And the poor husbands are left at home doing domestic women's labor while she is out in the public realm with no regard for husband or children. And so these two images that you see here represent a flurry of postcards as well as many written arguments that showed women's suffrage destroying marital harmony. Suffragists recognized both the power and the appeal of these gendered arguments and worked to redirect this public narrative by associating themselves with gender and marriage norms. First, they distanced the mainstream movement from sex radicalism and divorce reform, even insisting that they would remove people from their organizations if they lacked proper sexual morals. And they insisted that healthy and content marriages, families, and communities could be better achieved with votes for women. So I'm going to touch on three categories that these arguments kind of fell into, and this is just my effort to sort of group them to talk about them in a concise way. One is the theoretical level, discussing ideals about husbands and cooperative marriages and how marriage can work with the vote. Two is the individual level, where suffragists showcased the romantic and marital lives of specific suffragists. And three is the community level, where suffragists insisted that homes, cities, and states remained stable when women voted. And in doing so, they pointed to the Western states where women had the vote. On this theoretical level, suffrage literature on marriage often tapped into evolutionary theories and debates about the differences between the sexes. This was often very complicated and messy as they wrestled with different evolutionary theories and how to define man and woman and how they related to each other. And many suffrage publications often contradicted themselves, including authors who contradicted themselves over different publications as well. But many of them tapped into the idea that distinct sex differences marked the superiority of the white race. And some suffragists used this to argue that white women were thus ideal partners for helping white men run the public sphere. This then appeared in suffrage arguments about cooperative marriage. They insisted that industrialization and urbanization had removed many of women's duties from the home and transferred them to state and corporate control. And men could not easily manage these domestic concerns that had moved into the public realm. It simply wasn't man's nature to care for education, clean food. Thus, according to suffragists, wives needed to assist their husbands in reforming laws concerned with disease, sanitation, alcohol, food, and health. This argument flipped anti-suffrage claims about the disruption of domestic life to justify female enfranchisement as a tool of the municipal family, where husbands and wives worked cooperatively to improve society. So rather than being a disruption of gender and marriage norms, women's suffrage served to solidify, yet modernize, the natural, separate, and complementary functions of the two sexes. On an individual level, the suffrage movement tried to counteract anti-suffrage claims by putting their personal lives on display. This took many forms, including a married couples day held in New York City, where husbands took to the platforms and spoke about how wonderful their wives were and how perfect their marriages were. And another common form was biographies, where biographers explained that Susan B. Anthony simply never met the right man, and like any woman, she would have married if she had simply met him, and instead she dedicated herself to a greater cause. But the example I want to talk about more right now are suffrage baby shows. In the 1910s, suffragists around the country displayed their children in baby shows as the ultimate proof of their commitment to monogamous and reproductive marriage. Now, better baby contests existed outside the suffrage movement and started before the suffrage movement picked them up. They grew out of eugenics and the scientific breeding of livestock. And this is very evident when you look at different names that were used for these better baby contests. Common ones, for example, include eugenic baby contests and human stock shows. They were often held at county fairs, and many of them were sponsored by the Children's Bureau. They evaluated children based on a range of physical and mental characteristics and potential defects, ranging from shape of the head to ear size, muscular coordination, rate of teething, deportment, and reaction times. Suffragists quickly capitalized on the growing popularity of these contests. They both submitted their children as entrants into these events, as well as creating their own specific suffrage baby shows. And newspapers responded well. This picked up in a lot of newspapers and was sort of a catchy, fun story. Newspapers reported that these suffrage children won all of the top honors, including suffragists earning prize for the finest set of twins and another prize for a mother with the largest family. And one Virginia newspaper reported on the local fair where the suffrage babies purportedly won every prize, and the mothers also won prizes for their preserves, pickles, and hog raising. So a range of domestic skills. And as these newspapers talked about these suffrage winning children, they drew on eugenic language and concerns over race suicide, arguing that these suffrage babies were proof that white suffragists were in fact raising large families. So it's really by displaying their children in suffrage baby shows and these broader baby shows where suffragists are using their children as a very tangible piece of evidence to show that they are monogamous, married, and reproductive, and declaring themselves committed to normative marriage. Finally, on the community level, this often involved suffragists insisting that homes, families, and communities remained stable when women voted. And as proof, suffragists pointed to the Western states where women were increasingly having the right to vote at that state and local level going into the 1900s and the 19-teens. So in print media, whether it was flyers, pamphlets, newspapers, calendars, postcards, all sorts of formats, suffragists were printing testimony from these Western states that said that women cleaned up politics and remained womanly. But even better, they claimed, divorce rates declined, husbands and wives bonded over politics, families were drawn closer, and homes were improved. The women remained womanly, the men remained manly, and marriages remained intact. Male testimony was especially prominent in these publications, which described them as objective and unprejudiced observers of local conditions. So these printed materials then often quoted governors, judges, elected officials, policemen, all these other prominent local men, who assured readers that there was no disturbance to home relations, that they had yet to hear of the first case of domestic discord, and that the results of women voting were good, not evil. So in these pamphlets, the movement often used conventional ideas about male authority to their advantage, deploying the testimony of Western men to convince men around the nation that marriages, homes, and communities remained intact after the extension of the franchise. Free love, divorce, spinsters, babies, and henpecked husbands. These were regular topics of debate as anti-suffragists and suffragists in the 20th century tried to convince the public precisely how women's voting rights would impact marriage. Anti-suffragists warned that suffragists were sex radicals who would tear apart marriages and families by introducing political tension into the tranquil domestic realm. Suffragists recognized the power and persuasiveness of these anti-suffrage arguments. So they co-opted them. They co-opted anti-suffrage arguments and manipulated them for their own purposes. They insisted that husbands and wives needed to work together and to vote together to improve the home and the nation. As Carrie Chapman Catt remarked in 1907, seat the queen of the home upon the throne of government beside the king of business and let them rule together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that wonderful paper. Our commenter today is Professor Kathi Kern. She is the Associate Provost for Teaching, Learning, and Academic Innovation at the University of Kentucky. A professor of history, she serves as the director of the Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching, where she oversees a range of teaching and learning services aimed at faculty and students in 17 colleges and online. Kern's research centers on the women's rights movement in America and focuses particularly on the ways in which politics, gender, and religion have mixed to create new ideological positions and social change in the United States. Professor Kern is the author of many articles as well as the book Mrs. Stanton's Bible, published in 2001. Currently, she is working on a book entitled The Tagore Craze in America, a study of American readers' engagement with the work of Rabindranath Tagore. Professor Kern.
Thank you so much. We have heard some terrific papers this afternoon. And I want to say that whenever I do a comment, I am reminded of the first time I gave a national conference paper, and I was very nervous. And my mother happened to call me, and I said, I'm really nervous to give this paper tomorrow. And she assumed I was nervous because I hadn't completed the paper, which was not true. It had to be sent in advance, like our authors today. I said, no, Mom, I'm not nervous about that. I'm nervous that I'm going to give this paper, and then someone older and wiser is going to stand up and tell the audience what was wrong with my paper. And she paused and she said, oh, Kathi, that can't be right. That's so rude. So I'm always reminded of my mother's, my mother who was a nurse, and her good sense about conference comments. It was a delight to read these papers, the longer versions of them. And like everybody, I really want to compliment the Massachusetts Historical Society for the exquisite organization of this event. It's really been terrific, and also very disappointing not to be with all of you in Massachusetts today. So taken together, these papers remind me a lot about the scare campaigns of my childhood around the Equal Rights Amendment. When I read these papers, I flashed back to the 1970s when opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment managed to reduce that simple language of equality. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That simple language of equality was reduced to a singular fear of shared genderless bathrooms, something that today we actually advocate for. The nonprofit institute, the Alice Paul Institute, refers to the ERA as a cultural inkblot on which people projected their greatest hopes and fears about the changing status of women. And I was reminded of that moment when I was reading these papers. By exploring the connection of the 19th Amendment to marriage, these papers help us to contextualize the opposition to the 19th Amendment and to really excavate and historicize the cultural fear unleashed by the possibility of political equality for women. Women's suffrage threatened a great deal, as we've heard in these papers. It threatened to destabilize gendered and racial norms, as Carol's paper demonstrates, and ultimately give way to interracial marriage. It threatened to undermine the sanctity of marriage, so much so, as Jessica illustrates, that suffragists had to go on the offensive and advertise their collective, reproductive, heterosexual domestic bliss. And I can add anecdotally from my own work that the battles over ratification of the 19th Amendment that Carol refers to in Tennessee unleashed a revival of the woman's Bible, as anti-suffragists plastered Nashville with broadsides condemning the woman's Bible, calling it Mrs. Catt's Bible, and pointing out that the passage of the amendment might bring the end to Christianity as we knew it. So Carrie Chapman Catt, the advocate in Jessica's paper, the queen of the home, the anarchist from Carol's paper, was not only accused of advocating interracial marriage, she was also personally responsible for undermining the Judeo-Christian tradition. Yet despite these threats to the bedrock of patriarchy, we know that voter participation actually declines after ratification. Voter participation in the US was already on a slippery slope from 1896 downward. And participation in elections in the US dipped to its lowest point in 1920 and 1924, despite the ratification of the 19th Amendment and the introduction of potential new voters into the electorate. The popular magazine Good Housekeeping asked aloud, was women's suffrage a failure? Yet on closer inspection, educational programs to teach voting to new voters in some locales coincide with campaigns to suppress the vote in 1920. The addition, for example, in the states of Connecticut and Massachusetts of a literacy test, Massachusetts added a poll tax to boot. Connecticut added longer residency requirements and a morals clause. Efforts to suppress the vote of Black women in particular were transparent. Black women's efforts to register were denied or drawn out, particularly in the South. And I'm drawing here on the insights of political scientists Corder and Woolbrecht, who point out that the Chicago Defender, published in 1920, reports that those who sought to register and educate Black women voters in 1920 alone experienced murder, kidnapping, lynching, threats of arson against their homes and businesses. And in one town, 500 warrants against Black women charged with registering illegally. So I ask, must local and state efforts to suppress women's vote in the election of 1920 be understood in the context of these two excellent papers we've just heard? Fear of a fundamental transformation of marriage and the family did not simply evaporate with ratification. As the evidence from our authors indicate, the years immediately following ratification were to be carefully guarded. And in Carol's paper, she refers to Tennessee and Herschel Candler, who warned, within a very few years after this amendment has passed, you will find Congress has legislated so as to compel we people of the South to give Negro men and women their full rights at the ballot box. These papers deepen our understanding of the cultural milieu suffragists negotiated in their efforts to bring equal citizenship to women. In Carol's paper, The Specter of Miscegenation, intentionally attributed to the 15th Amendment, morphed and moved seamlessly into the discursive realm of the 19th Amendment. An important, though overlooked, context of the 19th Amendment was the passage of anti-miscegenation laws by more and more states after the Civil War. I'm glad you drew our attention to this, because even in the Loving v. Virginia decision in 1967, the lawyers for the Loving couple talk about miscegenation laws as slavery laws. And of course they were in Virginia, but we see them proliferating. In the longer version of Jessica's paper, she shares with us a tantalizing source from Lancaster, Ohio, suggesting that the 19th Amendment would lead to a different kind of sexual anarchy, the masculinization of women who would, quote, seek modest young ladies to marry. Carol uses Frederick Douglass's marriage to Helen Pitts to illustrate how explosive the topic of interracial marriage was, even among would-be progressives. Carol quotes the correspondence between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony on Douglass's marriage. Anthony is desperate in this exchange to stop Stanton in her tracks, particularly in her what she would go on to do, which is to offer a public congratulations to Douglass on his marriage. She spends page after page trying to dissuade Stanton from congratulating Douglass, Anthony's arguing to Stanton that Douglass has compromised the movement. And Anthony said, we cannot put him in front of our constituency any more than we can put Victoria Woodhull or Mary Walker, because their issues are not our issues. Interracial marriage, or as Anthony called it, the amalgamation of different races, is a scientific question that affects men and women equally. It's not a women's issue. It doesn't belong on our platform. Anthony catches herself really trying to dictate policy to Stanton and pauses and says, I said to myself, if I send this, it may make her do the very thing I want her not to do. So reinforcing Carol's point that suffragists were intentional in distancing themselves from the controversies over interracial marriage, even as they might support the idea of racial progressivism. And I think this is a really important connection between the two papers, and a very important contribution of Jessica's work here, that private lives were in many ways off limits in the 1880s when Douglass is marrying. And I'm thinking too about the suffragists who get divorced in these years. One that comes to mind in 1906, Clara Colby, who's in a marriage that she's completely committed to, but her husband wants to divorce her. They divorce in 1906. He's impregnated a household worker in their family. She still doesn't want to get divorced, but he insists on it. And then that divorce is used as a cause of shame for the women's rights movement. So we see, I think, in connecting Carol's paper and Jessica's paper, that this idea of like, let's keep this stuff off the platform, to a real change in policy that Jessica has illustrated, a reversal in strategy. The married lives of suffragists were part of a national conversation, a conversation they had to wrestle to the ground to control that discourse with their stories of model husbands and better babies. These papers remind us that the 19th Amendment threatened to create a new independent relationship between women and the state. Black and white women voted in record numbers in Reconstruction, in the New Departure. They attempted as women to use the 15th Amendment to assert that relationship between themselves as political actors and the state. Ultimately, they were turned back by the Supreme Court. By establishing the right for women to vote through the 19th Amendment, citizenship replaced coverture and marriage as the primary defining relationship between women and the state. And I think these papers help us to understand the resistance to political citizenship, to full equality for women. Upending coverture and marriage as the frame for women's political identity appeared to threaten something sacred: marriage and family, marriage between appropriate people, marriage as a way to maintain the separation of the races or white supremacy. So much so that Jessica's protagonists have intentionally reclaim that debate and situate this new invented family as the ideal voting bloc. So I want to thank both of our authors for these terrific papers, and we want to spend a lot of time that remains with questions, but I thought I would just throw out a question for each of the authors to get us started. You may respond to these or not. The question I have for Carol is, what do you have to say about the 14th Amendment? You mentioned it a few times in passing. And at the end of your paper, you really focus on the debate over the 15th Amendment, the fear that voting rights for African Americans would lead to marriage rights and social equality. And if we dial forward to the important marriage debates of our time, Loving v. Virginia for you old people like me, and Obergefell, the 15th Amendment is not really what's at issue so much as the 14th Amendment. It comes into sharp focus. So are your historical protagonists thinking about the 14th Amendment, and how do you see that fitting in? And then my question for Jessica, to what extent is the manipulation of marriage and its sort of deployment in the print culture, how much of this is part of the larger cultural conversation around companionate marriage? Are suffragists being attacked for the destruction of marriage at a time when the popular ideas are really changing around them? So I just would be interested in your thoughts about how this conversation among suffragists to reclaim marriage is influenced by these other cultural trends. So thank you both very much.
Thank you very much, Kathi, for those comments. If Jessica and Carol would like to turn their cameras on and rejoin us, they will have an opportunity to respond to Kathi's questions or comments.
So should I respond?
You may.
Okay, sounds good. So I think, the 14th Amendment is very interesting, right? And I think it's the different way that the 14th Amendment was interpreted in the 19th century by the courts than the 20th century, and that comes into play with Pace versus Alabama. And it was just not, it wasn't viewed as the giver of rights and equality in quite the same way. And, as many of the historians in the audience will know, it was mostly thought of in relation to labor law and right to contract and all of that. So I think that's one of the reasons why the 14th Amendment was not quite as present in the minds of people interested in marriage and suffrage as it was. But I do think that, Kathi and I were both at a conference in January, back when people could travel, in France and Belgium, in which we heard a very interesting paper from a law professor talking about how little the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment had actually been used in jurisprudence. So that's another interesting, I think, question that for all scholars of suffrage and voting rights, right, is why have not these two amendments to the Constitution produced more jurisprudence?
Thank you, Carol. All right, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you, Kathi, for that excellent comment and for your great question. I certainly do think that their use of companionate marriage and talking about sort of a new way to understand husbands and wives working together was certainly part of them embracing larger ideas about changing marriage and changing roles for women and for men. I had mentioned in the paper that there was this sort of like incident where a suffragist wrote about the ideal husband and how the ideal husband could be called a suffragent, because he is a gentleman who is willing to support his wife's like mental development and her self-improvement and her access to political rights, versus a husbandette is a man who is too feeble and clings to his wife's skirts and wants to hold her back. And this pairs very much with material that I didn't bring into the paper, but was about the suffrage movement also encouraging men to become new men, to join the new woman and to become a new man who is not afraid to have women have access to political rights, and to sort of know that the roles for men and women can change and evolve while also still, without destroying what people understood as there being sex differences, to say women are still women, men are still men, but we can strive for like a higher idealism and a better self-improvement. And we can do that together. It doesn't just need to be the new woman who's a danger. Instead, you should become a new man as well. And so I think that is very much part of that. I think that sort of speaks to that question.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, we have now entered the Q&A portion of this program. So if audience members would like to raise their hands or type in questions into the Q&A box, we can start reading those to the panelists. Let me start off by asking Carol and Jessica. So of course, marriage is a legal contract, and we're talking about law and legality and whatnot. And I think Kathi briefly mentioned this in her comments, but it seems like religion seems to be lacking here or missing here. And I was wondering if you could both speak to the issue of religion, religious groups, and how they weighed in on this debate.
I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I would say the way religion played into discussions about interracial marriage was mostly when activists would talk about sexual immorality, and that legalization of interracial marriage would cut down on sexual immorality, sex outside of marriage, adultery, other kinds of sexual vice, right? If people can have sex and marry who they want, then that cuts down on the reason to violate the law, in other words. And so in that sense, especially in the 19th century, there's sort of a broad evangelical Christian desire to promote sexual morality, and certainly the suffrage movement, especially after the Comstock Law, was a part of that, right? To fight prostitution and protect innocent young women, the virtue of innocent young women. Social purity focused especially on white women, but activists like Ovington would also focus on Black women as well. And so I think that's where it comes into it, but otherwise it was not quite as evident. I don't get a lot of, ministers chiming into the conversation necessarily or anything like that.
Yeah, and a lot of the material that I look at has, so far from my work, has been very focused on, I think of it as like ephemera, as sort of printed items that were meant for one use, pamphlets, flyers, postcards, calendars. And a lot of that, from the things that I've looked at, haven't focused too much on religion in a specific way, but they use religion as, in the broader sense, where they're not necessarily getting into like denominational specifics, but where they're saying God has made men and women separate. We still believe in these natural God-given divisions between the sexes, and also these sort of overlays of sexual morality, like Carol was referring to. And in a different part of my work where I talk about sexuality more broadly beyond marriage, I also talk about how suffragists talked about the vote as being a cure against red light districts and vice, and how women can bring this sexual morality into the public realm through their vote. And of course that's linked to marriage as well, because you're seeing them say, we're married, we're reproductive, we're moral, we sort of abide by these, they are sort of religious tenets at the base of it, and we can bring that into the public realm as well.
Excellent, thank you. Let's go to some questions from the audience. This first one from Laura Prieto. She's actually on the panel for tomorrow. She says, thank you for a very interesting panel. Reflecting on the papers together, it seems suffragists were really on the defensive when it came to marriage. Would Carol and Jessica please say more about whether the suffrage movement had factions that voiced more radical critiques of marriage, even if it was politically inexpedient to do so?
Oh, there were certainly many more radical factions and people who, there were critiques of marriage and family, everything from, talking about women's rights to property and wages and child guardianship. Those things are, I think, inherently critiques of marriage, to people who referred to it as a form of state-sanctioned prostitution, and people who advocated for divorce rights. Those are all certainly there. It just happens to be that for the material I look at, we're looking at this very like public forward, like we need to convince the public that we're okay. And those aren't the arguments that you're putting forward in flyers by the turn of the century for at least not from NASA, from some of these groups, to try to get them very much forward. But I think that's also what I have not done, but hope to do as I continue with the project, is to compare the difference between this print material and other realities, because, you very much, there's this line of argumentation that they put out, but then people also privately or in other publications say, talk about these restrictions of marriage and the ways in which it's unfair, and there's things that need to be resolved and worked on. And so that's, I had a specific example that I forgot. Oh, even example, I have some letters where Susan B. Anthony is writing to another suffragist and talks about how her children are such a burden, and if there's some way she could get someone else to take care of the children for a while, it'd be great, because then she could really focus on her suffrage work, which is not the messaging they're putting forward in the documents I'm highlighting. But that's certainly there, that those critiques exist in many ways. It just kind of buried, a lot of, for NASA and other groups, you wanted to, they decided to have this sort of more intense focus on obtaining the ballot and putting aside other reforms. That was a little rambling, but I don't know if you have more to say, Carol.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, in my recent book, I talk a lot about the relationship between free love and feminism in the 19th century, and the overlap, much to feminist dismay, in their arguments about marriage, right? And for divorce and for women's right to control their bodies and other aspects of feminist critique of marriage. I think for the purposes of this paper, I mention the critique of Mary White Ovington that Saidiya Hartman raises in her recent book, which is that Ovington was unmarried, and even though she was quite supportive of protecting African American women and their bodily autonomy, she was also sometimes critical of what she called the surplus African American women in New York City, for them to get married and the resulting sex outside of marriage that occurred. But Hartman is very critical of Ovington because Ovington, in fact, likely had an affair with a married man herself, right? So that there's also always a public stance and then a private stance on sexuality, you know, and it's the sort of juggling between the two that often gets activists caught up.
Well, and I think I wanted to add that sort of idea of like the juggling of a public and a private stance is I have a letter that I've used in other portions of my work where Anna Howard Shaw, I don't remember who she's writing to, but she's writing privately to another suffragist and says, I'm tired of being called like a radical and a free lover. I'm tired of all these like sexual charges. And she goes on about it for a while, like very clearly frustrated. And then she kind of pauses, and the next line is like, well, I guess we better create another pamphlet arguing that we're sexually moral. So I feel this like intense personal frustration with it, but then, now we gotta, because she even says like, I will stop addressing these things. I'm not gonna keep trying to convince the world I'm moral. But then in the next line is like, okay, well, we need to create a pamphlet convincing people we're moral. So yeah.
Right. We have a question for Professor Faulkner. Massachusetts passed a law in 1913 forbidding the interracial marriage of non-residents. Were such laws common in states that allowed interracial marriage?
That is a great question that I do not know the answer to, but I think that timing is very significant because it does seem to follow that 1912 marriage of Jack Johnson, in which states were trying to protect that, you know, to stop that from happening in their own states, while at the same time maintaining, at least in Massachusetts, this tradition going back to to about 1840 of allowing interracial marriage as a matter of principle and equality. So I think that's very interesting, and I wish I knew the answer.
Well, so speaking about what else is going on at this time, this is also the age when you had a lot of reforms to political participation, the secret ballot, referendum, and all that. And I was just thinking, does any of this have to do with this? Would women voting be a concern if there was no secret ballot? If husbands could guarantee that their vote would in fact double, would that actually present a problem, do you think?
Well, I do have these, there were a couple of them that I drew from, a couple of pamphlets that were addressed specifically to men. From NASA, I think was at least one of them, and another one came from a state organization. And I wanted to include it when I was talking today, but cut it because I was afraid of time. And so this pamphlet, but I have it here. So the pamphlet was titled "For Men Only," and I think it has a very sort of conspiratorial tone, like it's sort of whispering things to the male reader. And it says, "The truth is that we are offering to double the most valuable thing you have. Don't you see that your wife's interests are the same as yours, and therefore her vote would reinforce your vote?" And that yours is in all caps. And this is coming from NASA. It's coming from, you know, the largest suffrage organization, and it's promising men that their power will be doubled. And it's an interesting, you know, it's not the only pamphlet that says this, so it's not just a fluke, but it's this interesting contrast to most suffrage claims, because very frequently suffragists were saying, women deserve their own voice. They will not simply parrot men, because the common argument against suffrage was, what's the point? Women are going to agree with the men in their lives, and you'll just add more needless votes to it. So I don't know. It's kind of this. It's an interesting part of this literature, and again, it's just a small little segment of literature that's directed at men, that sort of reassures them, like, things will not change for you, your wife will not change, in fact your vote will increase, which is implying that they'll maintain a certain control over that secret ballot, like that the women will continue to sort of vote with them. But that, again, that contradicts so many other things that NASA was saying, that I think, for me at least, with what I'm researching, I think that's part of that attempt to sort of soothe and lessen fears when these kinds of examples come up.
Great, thank you. Carol, did you want to add something?
Oh, I was just going to say, and I think since Kathi was talking about what happened after the 19th Amendment, I think is that women did vote with their husbands. I mean, they didn't break party. We have a gender gap now that seems to be increasing, but that wasn't necessarily the case in the 1920s. I don't know if Kathi wants to add anything there, since she.
Well, I'm not familiar with the pamphlet that Jessica's got, but I just think that is part of a conversation about. It's potentially a conversation about white supremacy that might be somewhat coded, but we have lots of evidence from your papers and from other sources about the leaders like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt trying to reassure Southern white men that this will not lead to that white supremacy can be maintained with women's suffrage. So I would probably look for connections in that kind of double your vote commentary with white supremacy.
Yes, and I have pamphlets I've used in other portions of my work where they say, oh yes, you might have to be concerned about Black women getting the vote, but don't worry, we'll suppress their vote in the same way that we've suppressed Black men's votes, and by allowing there's often that language of your women, allowing your white women to vote, they'll vote with you and counteract any potential Black women's vote, and further counteract Black votes even more so, because you're adding to your sort of white voting base, and they'll agree with you.
So this next question goes along those lines. What do these linkages between marriage and the vote tell us about how people understood the vote itself? Were people just worried that the vote would enable new laws, or were people connecting voting as an expression of political desire with expressions of sexual desire?
That's a very interesting question. I think there's certainly a gendered element to it, right? So all the prerogatives of manhood are wrapped up in the vote, and that includes sexual prerogatives. And if women gain those sexual prerogatives, if African American men gain those sexual prerogatives, if African American women gain them. So I do think there's a certain amount of that going on. But it's sort of interesting to me that political rights then, even perhaps more so than now, stood in for all rights, right? That political rights were a sign of equality in a way that other kinds of legal equality or economic equality just were not taken into consideration. And so because of that, voting, especially, around the 15th Amendment, most of all, had the potential to upend all sorts of ways that society was ordered, and that's wrapped up in sexual rights and the sexual double standard as well, for sure.
Jessica, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm afraid my audio cut out just enough that I think I missed enough of the question that I'm afraid that I'll.
Would you like me to reread the question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so the question is, let's see here. What do these linkages between marriage and the vote tell us about how people understood the vote itself? Were people just worried that the vote would enable new laws, or were people connecting voting as an expression of political desire with expressions of sexual desire?
Well, I certainly think from the anti-suffrage arguments, there were a lot of fears that it was fear, you know, at least they sort of put this fear and this image out that people who believed in women's rights and who wanted the right to vote didn't just want that they wanted, you know, a huge range of, that it could sort of be anything, that they were, and I didn't get into it too much here, but almost that they're kind of like sexual deviants who are going to want to change everything. You know, there's references to birth control, there's references to polygamy and change, you know, like I had this great example of I think it was Alva Belmont, actually. The person never named her. There was someone who wrote newspaper articles condemning suffragists for practicing tandem polygamy. And by tandem polygamy, he meant quickly divorcing someone and then getting married again. So like serial monogamy, I guess. So like sort of repeatedly going between different relationships, but still married, but doing that intentionally just because you want to switch up sexual partners. And they never named who it was, but I do think it was Alva Belmont based on some references in there. And so I think that there's I'm losing track of what I was trying to say, but I think there's this sort of fear that people who want this extension of women's rights don't just want that. They want a lot of things, and that's going to be a tool to do that. And so there will be these sex radicals who want to use the vote as this method to change a lot of things in society, that it's not just about voting. And, you know, I don't see a lot of, you know, you don't necessarily see concern about, oh, the women are going to change the tax law in this small, you know, it's this fear that they're going to upend a lot of things with it. I think that kind of addresses that.
Great, thank you. Next question. If there are many social, legal, and constitutional hurdles for interracial marriages, what are the implications to the mixed blood children as a result of an interracial union? Frederick Douglass is both black and white. Mary Church Drell is the same case, so on and so forth. Wouldn't interracial children represent the direction to interracial equality and interracial democracy, especially in the suffrage era?
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting question. You know, and it's certainly, you know, one part of the question is the rights of children from interracial marriages or interracial unions and their own, you know, legal standing. And the other is, as the question suggests, this idea that interracialism can eventually lead to the extinguishing of differences between the races. And certainly that's something that activists in the NAACP considered. You know, so Mary White Ovington, I quote her in the paper as saying something like, you know, the white race is getting just a little bit darker and the black race is getting just a little bit whiter, and neither of those things are a matter of any importance whatsoever. You know, and they often pointed to historical examples. You know, Addie Hunton points to the Normans and the Saxons, and you know, various minglings of different, you know, quote unquote races from the past. And so I think that there's a lot of consideration of how racial mixing can solve the you know, the race question, but I do think it's a very controversial opinion, because many African American leaders, of course, wanted first and foremost to get respect for black families and black children and black marriages, even before they addressed the question of interracial marriages. And Tara Hunter makes that point in her recent book about marriage, which is basically that, you know, interracial marriage gets a lot of attention, but really what was important to most African-American families was African-American marriages. So.
Jessica, did you want to comment?
I mean, just that, at least from the work from my work on the suffrage baby shows, it's very much just this effort through those, you know, they're very incredibly eugenic. You know, it's this effort to say that white families are going to stay white families, and that these women who are leading this movement are continuing to have children. So that's sort of about a concern about whether or not women are choosing to put off having children or not, and whether this interest in politics will lead to white women not wanting to have children. And so that those baby shows are that moment to sort of prove that they're still interested and are still having children. So I don't know if that directly speaks to that question, but that's kind of where sort of the closest that comes up in my research at the moment.
Great, thank you. We have a question here for both panelists. We know that privately, a number of female suffrage leaders had long-term intimate relationships with other women, a reality that is a contradiction to the suffrage movement's public embrace of traditional gender roles and domesticity. In your work, what have you seen in terms of intersections of suffrage and queer activism / history?
Oh, I'm still unmuted. So I was about to unmute myself, but I'm good. You know, it's actually something that I want to do more of, and that is missing from my work so far, because I have not really paired these printed publications with the actual realities. And I want to do it because, you know, it's clear, and I can see it in so many ways, that these public pronouncements do clash with these private realities. And I think Kathi had referenced a quote in my paper that I didn't bring up today, but it's this one about this fear that the women in the movement have too much. It's almost like they make this jump where they say women have too much respect and adoration and appreciation for other women, that there's too much female camaraderie within the movement, and that's starting to blur lines, and it's going to start becoming sexual interest, and it'll start becoming a desire to be with women as romantic partners. And so, and that particular news article says, you know, oh, we heard this example of a woman who went down and secured a marriage license to marry another woman, and that's what's going to happen if suffrage occurs, is they're going to start convincing nice young girls, you know, like innocent, unaware women, to start marrying them, that these, you know, masculine deviant suffragists will do that, and it'll have this snowball effect. And that's, you know, one of these few like hints about these, not hints, but that's, you know, one of the few examples I have of that fear of queer women coming in and sort of stealing other women, and that's what suffrage will do. And so, yeah, it's not there too much in my work yet, but it's something that I want to do, to bring in both more of the fears about heterosexual sexuality, and then to bring in actual private lives and consider some of those rapid disjunctures between what they're putting out in these print publications and what their actual private realities are.
Could I jump in there, even though
Absolutely.
I'm just the commentator, but I was thinking it as we've been going through this panel, because the very people who we're quoting, right? Carrie Chapman Catt has a long-term relationship with Mary Garrett Hay, and Anna Howard Shaw is a long-term relationship with Lucy Anthony, you know, so much so that Susan B. Anthony thinks she has to buy both of them lifetime memberships in suffrage, because if she buys it for one, they'll just give it to the other person. And, you know, and we're in this moment. I mean, part of what Jessica's papers caused us to think about this kind of reclaiming marriage as something that needs to be infused with heterosexual desire, right, is part of what's happening is this shrinking of space for a respectable Boston marriage, same-sex marriage. So that generation has the ability to kind of live their lives and in the ways they want, make these pronouncements about, promoting heterosexual marriage and, the queen on the throne in a way that later generations and more medical and popular discourse condemning same-sex desire becomes more problematic and something that younger women have to wrestle with more.
And I also think there's something very much to proving that the marriage is reproductive. At times just showing that the female suffragist is married to a man also isn't enough. You have to prove that you have babies as well. Because if you're not carrying it through to children, you're still not fulfilling that ultimate goal of marriage. So that's also further proving your heterosexuality and your commitment to marriage, is it must be reproductive.
Yeah, just to support Kathy's point, I'll just give an example from my book Unfaithful, which is the relationship between Mary Booth and Matilda Annika. And Mary Booth's husband was a total jerk. But anyway, so she leaves him and goes to Switzerland with Matilda Annika for 4 years. And they're clearly deeply in love. And eventually the relationship ends, but her husband actually accuses her of having an affair with Mr. Annika rather than Matilda, because it was so far outside the realm of what people thought or proposed that it wasn't even on the radar, to get back to Kathy's point about privacy.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and this will go to all three of you. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. I'm especially glad to hear them, since I haven't seen many conversations about marriage and women's suffrage during this centennial moment. Have you? Why do you think this might be the case? Do you see a legacy of these historical debates today?
Well, Allison, thank you so much for that question. And it's been really fun to see the names of so many suffrage historians coming up on the chat, even though I think we're not supposed to be looking at the chat. But, I was thinking about that a little bit too, reading the papers, that that marriage hasn't gone anywhere, right? And, there was a point in gay and lesbian rights where lots of people were like, really? We're going to fight for military inclusion in the military, and we're going to fight for marriage? That's what we're going to fight for? And, so I often wonder about, the Teflon nature of marriage. And I defer to Carol, who writes a lot about this, but who I think also I've heard you say at conferences, Carol, you wonder why people marry anymore. But it's interesting. It keeps coming around as an organizing principle, as a way of connecting rights to private life. And let me toss it over to my experts.
Yeah, I also have not seen much synergy between marriage and the anniversaries of the amendments either. And even though I do always say what Kathi says, why do people still get married? Which my husband loves, so sorry. I do think that in some ways, even though I always say that, in some ways, marriage is declining, right? So we also have this situation where marriage is, I don't know, one writer once called it a gated community, right? It's an elite mode of property and wealth transfer to future generations, and so I do think marriage is changing in some ways and potentially will change and will decline in the future. And I think it's also just that it's not so important for women's status anymore. And so even though you still see some of the tensions between the interests of single women versus married women, between women who are mothers, women who are not mothers, that for the most part, while they might be the center of women's daily existence, they're not necessarily the focus of political movements necessarily. So that perhaps is why.
Yeah, I'll echo others that I haven't seen as much conversation on it as maybe I would have expected. But something that when I'm thinking about this question of like the legacy today and how it connects to things. When I was working on my dissertation, it was during the lead up to, and then the 2016 Women's March happened while I was working on some portion of this. And sometimes I found that there were striking parallels and striking similarities. As much as things change over a course of 100 years, sometimes things can echo. And I don't know if people may remember it or not, but there was an article that came out, I believe it was in the New York Times, that was about husbands in New Jersey and what were they going to do because all of their wives, all of the women have gone off to DC to march, and they have to take care of the children and the home, and it was like this little case study of this town without women, and what does it look like? And when you look at it, there's even pictures. There were pictures that accompanied that article that that are almost the exact same kind of like layout and structure of like dad and child, and he's looking confused, that you see on anti-suffrage postcards from 100 years sooner. And many people there was backlash against that article about it being condescending, and, men are fathers and husbands as well, and they can manage without women. But it also, then with the subsequent coverage on the Women's March and their continued activism, there continued to be some of these parallels where it's the fear, what do you do when women want public roles and certain rights? And then there was often I found parallels in terms of response and reassurance. There's an example where the Women's March organizers, it was within that same year, they shared an article about them onto their social media accounts that was written about how the focus of the article was how they are suburban mothers, how they're your wives and your mothers and your daughters, and they just want to help their families and make things better. And again, it just very paralleled that same rhetoric, and both of them have to do with marriage, and whether or not women seeking rights is a challenge to that, and whether we need to be concerned. And again, there was that kind of, there's a lot of other responses that don't fit in this, but it was that eerily similar, the fear and then the reassuring response. That, I don't know, I just think it's interesting, and I think it can speak to how obviously so many things have changed, yet some of the same concerns and anxieties over gender and gender roles and marriage can also be very eerily similar today.
All right. Thank you so much for your responses. I think we will call it there. We've had a great panel and a great session, great questions from everyone. I would encourage everyone to join us again for the third panel in our conference tomorrow at 2 p.m., the federal government and voting rights in states and across the empire. And so we have papers here that cover the issue of African American suffrage in Western state constitutions, what's happening in Oklahoma and the decision that inhabitants there have to make, and then also the issue of the 19th Amendment in the Philippines and the American Empire there. So 3 wonderful papers coming up for tomorrow's session at 2 p.m. Thank you to our panelists and for our commenter for joining us today, and to all of you audience members for spending a little bit of your afternoon with us and our conference. Thank you. So take care and have a wonderful afternoon, and we hope to see you tomorrow.